And welcome to all our guests this morning. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. During the presentation, please feel free to add any questions, comments, thoughts that you have in the chat. And then after the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for some discussion. Depending on how things go, how many questions we have, perhaps some of you might like to actually speak directly with our presenters today. So really looking forward to some rich discussion after this. I think really that is probably it from me. I'm Sarah Gilly. I'm one of your Alternative Education Special Interest Group co-conveners, and I have been incredibly grateful to Cormac and colleagues and to Garvin and the Bearer team for helping us put this together today. So that's been a real pleasure. And I don't know, Stefania and Fadwa, would you like to quickly introduce yourselves?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Fadwa Govertz from the University of Bath. I am also one of your co-conveners. Lovely seeing new faces, but also lovely to see familiar faces. I'm really pleased to see you, Cormac and Anne-Marie, again. We had a lovely time at Beara, and I can see some new people that I don't recognize from their names ever being to one of our events. So very warm welcome to our SIG, and yeah, looking forward to the presentation today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stefania Romano from University of Leeds. I've got the pleasure to be another co-convener with Sarah, Fadwa, and Sharon. We are really excited to be with you today and to have this our event. We are really thankful to Cormac and Anne-Marie to sharing their insights, and we've been enthusiastic about the project, so we're looking forward to listen from them, and thank you for everyone to participate with us. We do hope this is the first of many other active events. So I stop now. So thank you so much.
Okay, so I think we'll hand over to Cormac. Are you back in control of your slides, or do you need Garvin to give you control?
I can do that, I think, yeah.
Lovely. Well, I'll turn off my camera and look forward to hearing everything.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So good morning, everybody. We're delighted to be here. Just to introduce myself, my name is Cormac Forkin. I have been the lead researcher on a project over the last 5 to 6 years on alternative education in Ireland. I'm joined by Dr. Tanya Kovacic, who has been the senior researcher on the project with me over that time, as well as Anne-Marie Chalou, who joined us more recently. And we've also colleagues Caroline Fahy, who can't be here today, Brendan and Pat Dolan, and going back to the very start, Leonor Rodriguez as well, who has been very much kind of part of the work. We also have our colleague Joe Malone, as you mentioned, Sarah, from Rethink Ireland, who has funded this work, and we'll hear more from Joe shortly. And later we'll be joined by Tim Goodspeed, our colleague from Social Value UK, who has been helping us think through the nature of our methodology, particularly around social return on investment. So I'll kick off and just introduce what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. But before I say that, just to give you 2 minutes of a kind of a summary of where things are from an Irish perspective. The reason that we called this Opening the Black Box in relation to alternative education in Ireland is because, as some of you might know, alternative education has been, up until relatively recently, ignored by government and ignored by state policy, and has been virtually hidden really from kind of normal discourse and normal kind of research endeavours and so on. So that's why when we started this work at Rethink, we were really keen to try and uncover what exactly goes on in a selection of alternative education projects, what are the benefits and so on. And to do that work, to bring it forth and to try and challenge the views and develop new evidence and so on. So like from the UK's perspective and from England in particular, the Mills and Thompson's work, the 2018 work on the review of alternative ed, it's very much ahead of us in relation to where we are. So we're kind of at that stage where we're beginning to acknowledge alternative education, as we'll see as we go through. But what we know of in England in particular is that bit more developed and more advanced. So it'll be interesting to see your thoughts on this kind of as well. Just to say as well, just the final bit before I do the outline, is that Tanya, Anne-Marie, myself and the rest of the team, we're all based in the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre in the University of Galway over on the West Coast. And our work since the centre was created has been trying to generate evidence for better practice and policy, so in child, youth and family services. So that's why we're very much interested in this work as well. So we're delighted, as I said, to rethink with us on this journey as well. So by way of outline, what we're hoping to do over the next kind of 40 minutes or so is just to give a context for alternative education in Ireland, that you have an understanding of that. So Tanya and Maria are going to bring you through 3 different things. The idea of persistent education inequality in Ireland, and what is it or why is it that that's still there, and what underpins that? Is there any kind of notion of why that is the case in Ireland? We're then going to look at international models of alternative education. We've done a lot of work on this, trying to conceptualize it and understand it from where it fits within an alternative education international perspective. And then we're going to just present to you where things are at from a government perspective in Ireland on a recent review of what they call out of school provision. So hopefully that will give you the context for what we want to talk to you about. Then Joe's going to talk to you about Rethink Ireland and how Rethink Ireland used a social innovation approach, because they're social innovators, to respond to this need around particularly education inequality. So I'll let Joe do that, obviously, when the time comes. And then we'll get into the study itself, just to talk to you about what we did, what our core findings are. And what we've done is we've presented them by 3 themes that will hopefully help you to appreciate the nature of what we have, and then just some concluding comments around what this means for us in Ireland and elsewhere, particularly around a conceptual model that we've developed as a result. So that's it, I think. So Tanya, I'll hand over to you, and you can start away. So thank you.
So good morning, everyone. So I'm going to lead you to the context for alternative education in Ireland, the first part of it, and then I'm going to pass the word to a colleague of mine, Anne-Marie. So just first, we would like to actually focus on this idea of persistent education inequality. So we do know that since the independence of the Irish state, educational inequality has been a persistent feature in the Irish education system. This very much means that students from different socioeconomic backgrounds attain different educational outcomes. And this is very visible from examples that we listed below. So for example, a ratio of 4.9 students from disadvantaged areas in connection to 10 students from affluent areas attend third level institutions. So we also know that 92% people actually complete second level education in Ireland. So the completion rate is actually quite high, and the Irish government actually likes to promote this. But there is a question what's happening with the remaining 8% of students. And I also would like to emphasize that also in these 92%, things are not exactly equal, as we will show you on the go. So since the formation of the Irish state, the government's response to education inequality has been kind of interesting. So it was always kind of focused more on schools and on schoolgoers, but it was less focused on structural inequality as such. So there was only one period in education since the independence of the state when government actually took education as a primary priority, and that was after the OECD Investment Education Report in 1965, when actually the government focused on widening participation to second level education and made it actually equal for the whole population. But not before and also after, actually, there was not a comprehensive structural focus of the Irish government in education as such. So we do know that if we look at the completion rate, as we mentioned already before, so as mentioned, basically Ireland has a high post-primary school completion rate. 8% do not complete, and there's a question mark. What happens to these students is a question. So this is a black box, as mentioned. We also want to point to this figure to the right, where you have dash and non-dash, it's written. So just to give you a feeling about that, one of the responses to tackle educational inequality in Ireland was through this so-called DASH program. So delivering of equality of opportunity in schools plan, which was actually, which was kind of put in motion in 2005 and has been since updated in 2017. So the idea was very much to resource more those schools that are set in less affluent areas. And those schools who are set in less affluent areas are usually getting more resources than those schools who are not set in, let's say, less affluent areas. So that's why we distinguish between DASH and non-DASH schools in a very, very simple way. But as you can see, even when we go through all the PISA kind of measurements, there is a distinctive difference between the results between DASH and non-DASH schools. So let's say students who attend DASH schools would be performing worse in connection to very basic reading skills, would be performing also worse in connection to mathematical skills, literacy skills in general. So that even though that there is a sort of more input put towards DASH schools, the difference between outcomes in DASH and non-DASH schools remains. So Cormac, you can go to the next slide. So we've been kind of, when we've been exploring the idea of alternative education in Ireland, and when we worked actually on our own study, we also looked a little bit at how actually the state develops a sort of an ideological outlook towards educational system. And there are things that are actually recognized by the government or by the governmental structure itself. So let's say the Oireachtas report very much recognizes that the current education system is unfair and it is unequal, and that educational inequalities have been strongly legitimized through the ideological lens of meritocracy. Also, when you look at some other acts and policy documents in place, for example, the Education Act 1998, I'm sorry, I lost my light here, so I'm back. So this document very much promotes the idea of educational disadvantage as such. So even the language educational disadvantage very much focuses on individual and explores the idea of educational success, if you put it like this, through a very meritocratic point of view, without looking at the structural possibilities and outcomes that we develop in the state. And then the last one, which is very important, I believe, and it's not actually stressed enough, is that Ireland actually doesn't invest strongly in education. So in comparison with other OECD countries, Ireland invests 3.5% in primary, secondary, and third level education. This data is for 2016, in comparison with the average OECD countries, which is 5% of GDP. So it's significantly less, and I think it's actually very much at the bottom of OECD investment. So then when we did our research, we started first with looking at the meaning of alternative education internationally. So we did a kind of a literature review to kind of familiarize ourselves what the meaning of alternative education actually is. So we found out that alternative education has developed as a response to state-provided mainstream education, and that it differs from mainstream structures in its innovative curriculum, flexible programs, and that the studies correspond much more to students' interests and needs. So alternative education has developed as a response to traditional mainstream schools. And we kind of also know that those provisions cater mainly for students who, for various reasons, might not fit in mainstream schools. So there is something about the structure, it is something about personal interests and needs, and I think this kind of correlation between agency and structure comes here very much to the place. What we found very interesting and useful was that there were two perspectives on alternative education flying in the literature. So there was the idea of a learning choice and youth at risk. which is a completely different way of viewing, let's say, alternative education, or putting onus to a different place, as for example, Gavin Turney would say. So learning choice is very much the idea that those settings, alternative education settings, address the structural changes required for schools to change, while Youth at Risk's perspective very much focuses on changing learners' behavior and trying to actually adapt learner to the system, if you put it like this. So it's more of a last chance or remedial focus of alternative education. Now, you're all very familiar about characteristics of alternative education, so I'm not going to spend too much time in it, but very much innovative curriculum and flexible programs, much more corresponding to students' interests and needs. It focuses on more dynamic and different pedagogical approaches, supports, and structures. Again, finding much more of a way towards the student, and maybe also providing chances to co-creation and things like that. And one-to-one interactions between teachers and learners, and very different ways of relating with students and teachers have been recognized in the literature as well. So then we were also looking particularly in more kind of Anglo kind of economic model countries, how they kind of maybe developed the idea of alternative education. Why did we focus only on those countries? Because we believe that Ireland very much sides with these countries. So we wanted to find where we lean in connection to the economic model that we have in place. We were looking at policy responses and recognized that actually policy responses very much do develop in place and time, and again corresponds with the wider political and ideological outlook that is in place in a specific country in place and time. What has been very, very obvious, and maybe we can keep this as a point of a discussion later on with you coming from for a neighboring country, but we recognize that basically in the past decades, this neoliberal agenda and alternative education sector has been prevalent across the countries, so in the US, in the UK, and also Australia, and I would dare to say that also in Ireland, with a clear focus to conservative and more remedial orientation of alternative education. So more youth at risk than a learning choice version of alternative education. And we also looked at Scotland. Scotland was different. So, and again, you might be way more able and more familiar about the system than us, but we found it interesting that Scotland has developed a different approach to dealing with children who might have different interests and needs, and that basically maybe more mainstream school already caters for those students and doesn't develop an alternative system of education to do that, if you put it like this. So Cormac, just if you go to the next slide. And this is, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is just to show you the process. So we also try to, when we actually started to think about our own study, we were looking at these different typologies of alternative education provisions that were available in the literature. And then we kind of developed a sort of, as you can see, like a figure or a table, which helped us to see how these different typologies have evolved across different contexts. And this was done particularly with an intention that we could maybe develop our own typology and find and see what is similar or different in an Irish context. But you're probably quite familiar with this typology, so I'm not going to spend time on this, but you can see even from this table that it makes alternative education very interesting, but also it provides, as with more imagination, that alternative education is probably a very vague concept and a very vague term. So I'll stop here and I'll pass the words to my colleague, Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Tanya. Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be presenting today. So when we look at the Irish policy context, I suppose what's going on in terms of alternative education, as Cormac has alluded to, it has neither been defined nor recognised until very recently. It's been a hidden sector, as Cormac said. It's been ignored And I suppose in the general population, it's not really, or it hasn't been really spoken about. People don't know that it exists, really. I suppose, however, in 2022, the Department of Education published its first ever review of alternative education. And they defined it as a provision of education outside of the mainstream school setting for children who have become disengaged from mainstream education. And this review, it focused on services catering for young people aged 15 years and under. And I suppose within the review, they highlighted 23 projects in total. And these projects were delivered. There was a range of programs delivered through a range of programs and services throughout the country. And they catered for children who had disengaged from mainstream education or were at risk of disengaging from mainstream. And I suppose what the review found was that these projects offered a holistic sort of, they were holistic in how they delivered their program. They were needs-led, they were student-led, and they also engaged community services as well, community projects, and they went at the pace of the learner. So I suppose within that, the review also found that this sector remains vulnerable in terms of funding, sustainability and governance. And they made a number of recommendations on foot of that. And I suppose a few of those recommendations would have highlighted that a standardised structure is required for the governance of this sector. They also outlined that in order to receive state funding for this sector, that out-of-school settings would need to sort of meet a set of criteria in terms of level of education, level of education provision, levels of teaching and referral processes. So I suppose the review did not include all alternative education projects, of which there are many. Like for example, they didn't include in their scope projects serving those serving children and young people who are 15 years of age and over. It also, I suppose, didn't include young people who are within mainstream education, but however have chosen to engage with alternative education projects. So I suppose we would argue that, you know, there are many more projects out there. And that I suppose our research is sort of opening that black box in terms of what is out there. So I suppose I'll hand you over to Jo next to outline her part, and then Cormac will highlight further in relation to our research. So thanks.
Morning, folks. So I'll talk a little bit about Rethink Ireland. Our vision is a more just, equal and sustainable Ireland. We work towards that vision by providing cash grants and non-financial or business supports to charities and social enterprises working in Irish communities across the country. We work with companies, families, individuals, trusts and foundations and the Irish government. And through a range of partnerships, we create funds tackling issues such as educational disadvantage. We have what we call a venture philanthropy approach. So practically, this means that we provide cash grants to organisations, and we also work closely with them over time to maximise their impact. The types of supports that we provide will depend on the unique needs of organisations, but these often relate to strategy, sustainability, impact measurement, and communications. Since our first year of operations in 2016, we have created a 109 million social innovation fund. We've launched 58 individual funds, backed 448 innovative projects, supported over 137,000 learners and supported over 3,000 people into employment to date. We estimate that the fund has collectively reached over 1 million people, so more than 15% of the Irish population. Next slide. Cormac. So, ultimately, like, our interest is in finding innovative solutions to persistent social problems, and two of our core areas of focus are education and youth mental health. In that context, we introduced 3 funds that ran between 2017 and 2022, primarily the Education Fund, the Youth Funds, and the Children and Youth Funds. These funds all sought to tackle educational disadvantage and youth mental health challenges, albeit in different ways. And we provided funding and non-financial supports, business supports, to 39 awardee projects in total. At the same time, we commissioned an academic evaluation process to run alongside these funds so that we could generate social impact data and evidence to inform both practice and policy. Next slide, Cormac. So ultimately, we want to leverage our investments to inform the work of practitioners, policymakers, and public leaders. Our aim is that this research helps to move the conversation on how we can better support children and young people in Ireland, particularly those at a disadvantage. And it has been a pleasure to work with the UNESCO Child and Family Research team over the last 6 years to do that. I'll hand over to Cormac to continue.
Great. So thanks to Tanya, Marie and Joe, just for giving you the context of where we're coming from and so on. So I'm sure you have lots of questions about all of that element of the work and so on. So what I want to do now is introduce the overall kind of study to you, and obviously the findings, and then we can have a discussion about it. So just to say a little bit, just a few words about our methodology. So that the basic thing that we were asked to do was, particularly with the education projects, was to look at the extent to which the projects used practices and processes that would help people, young people in particular, who are in alternative education to progress their education and overcome the inequalities that they were experiencing and so on. So after co-creating the methodology with the participants and with the funders, with the projects, we decided to go with the social return on investment as the overarching project, or the overarching kind of methodology for the project. So as you may know, what that involves is, and I'll come back to this later on, qualitative data collection with all key stakeholders in every project that we engaged with. So of those projects, the 32 projects that we worked with, and then there's a quantitative phase where the outcomes that are identified from the qualitative phase are sent back out, where they can be quantified as part of the social return on investment piece. As well as that, we used a photo voice methodology approach, which I'll come to later on, where we encourage participants and learners to take pictures through the photo voice methodology as a way to describe what the projects meant to them and so on. So on the right hand side of that, what you can see is that what it allowed us to do then is to capture the lived experiences and the practices and processes of the learners, and then to translate that through the social return on investment approach into a monetary figure that policymakers understand, which I'll come on to later on, and obviously to do that to generate a return on investment ratio. So that's a snapshot of our methodology, and we're happy to talk about that in detail. Just as Joe mentioned, the two broad breakdown areas for the funds that we dealt with, or the projects we dealt with across the funds, were education and mental health. You can see the breakdown there in terms of those that participated fully in the evaluation. 24 of those, kind of 32, and then the projects that took part, 24 fully completed the evaluation with us. So let's have a look at the overall cross-cutting findings. What did we actually find? So as you can see on the left-hand side, first of all, the first theme that we'd like to talk about is capturing the enabling actions of awardee projects. So the first thing that we wanted to do was, as we got to know each project and got to know what went on in each project, we were acutely aware, as we've mentioned, that we don't have an awful lot of information in Ireland on the actions of awardee projects. So what we were trying to do was answer that first question. You can see, how do awardees support their participants? So what we did was we collected that qualitative information around the projects that we worked with and so on, and using the Terriali et al.'s model, we were able to recategorize that then into practices, processes, and actions. So as you can see on the far side on table 4.1, this is an example of what we were able to do. we were able to summarise for each awardee, we were able to summarise a description of what they do, and then the key actions or the key ways that they do that. And that evidence, if you think about it, over the kind of 5-year period that we were involved with the projects, that has never been done at this scale in Ireland before. So in terms of the number of projects taken part, the length of the study, and the sheer collection of data, the overall kind of amount of data that was collected. So the first time we were able to understand the nature of what these projects meant for participants and how the projects were able to do this work in the first place. The other lived experience element was, as I mentioned earlier on, the photo voice approach, and some of you will be familiar with this, but photo voice is a community participatory action research approach where the participants are given cameras, disposable cameras, to take pictures of things that are important to them that relate to the nature of the projects and so on. And it's a great way to give voice to people that may not have a voice otherwise, in relation to these kind of settings and so on. So what we're able to do with that is we're able to create the pictures, first of all, that the young people took, but also put text to it. So you can see on the bottom right some examples of the pictures and the text that went with it. And we created a website as well where we have portrayed that information about what the image was, what the text was, and more importantly, what the call to action is for these particular young people. What is it that they want to see happen in terms of their experiences in alternative education? So the first part of theme 1 was to capture those practices and processes. And, that's something that Tanya mentioned that has been well documented elsewhere in the literature about how alternative education providers do their work. But obviously we didn't know that from an Irish perspective, and we have that now. The second part of this theme 1 then was using the SROI data. We were able to capture and collate participant outcomes. So the way that it works is that we, through the qualitative phase, we asked participants to talk about their experiences in the projects, but also what outcomes did they think that they had achieved as a result of being involved in those respective projects. So you can imagine across the range of projects that were taking part, there were 29 overall outcomes that were identified. But what we were able to do then is we were able to categorize those down further into 16 overall categories. As you can see here, like they range very much from like community engagement, in other words, that being part of a project in the alternative education setting helps them to become part of their, involved in their community, down to category 6, for example, around empathy, better self-confidence in category 10, category 11, social skills. So a lot of these areas, as you can see, the obvious thing here is that it's not so much the educational outcomes that the participants talk about, and I'll come back to that later. It's these soft skills, it's these development of the soft skills, are the areas that we would see as being supportive of their educational progression is kind of what participants most valued and so on. So I'll come back to that in a while. So what we have so far from theme 1 then is we have the how and the what. So how is it that the projects rather do their work, and what difference does it make to the outcomes for the participants? So theme 2 then was understanding the positionality of the projects in relation to alternative education provision in Ireland. So as Anne-Marie mentioned, we had very little kind of image of what this actually looked like from a positionality perspective. What I mean by that is position of the provider and position of the recipient in relation to the mainstream education system. So we were very aware of the fact that this hadn't been done before. So one of the things that we did with Rethink Ireland was we wrote a composite report that pulled together the macro learning from across the 3 funds that Joe talked about. But as part of that, we were able to create this idea of positionality. So just want to show you this as an example of the way that we have conceptualized alternative education from an Irish perspective. So this is just a summary of the findings, but it shows the 4 categories. So if you just bear with me for a second, and I'll explain what they are. So on the right hand side, the far right, you have the positionality clusters, and we have the clusters called in to out, out to in, and out to out. So you're probably saying, have they lost their marbles? But this is the way we thought about it or described it. So on the left hand side then you have, for example, 1 project in each one of those clusters, the age ranges and so on, the target population and so on. But what the in to in and in to out describes is, for example, if you take the first project, the Trinity Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities, this is a project within the education system provided to students within the system. So projects that fell into that category, we call them in-to-in. And then the second one on Cusain, you can see this is a project within the community and higher education system, but it provided it to people that were returning to adult education or community education, so people on the outside. So we did this for all of the projects involved to see how could we categorize them in relation to that idea of the recipient and the provider. And what we found was something very interesting. And this is the bit that we presented, that Sarah mentioned at the start. We presented at the BEARA conference in September. You can see the in to out was only 4% of the total. The out to out was 70%. But the two most common categories that made up nearly 80% of the provision here was the in to in category, which was the most common, the second most common category. So in other words, something within the system that was providing an additional support around education of the learners or young people for participants within the system, or for young people within the system. But by far the most common one from the sample we had was the out to in. So in other words, organizations or interventions that existed on the outside of the system that were doing something for participants within the system or for learners within the system. That made up 54% of the sample. So when you bring all that together, you can see that the in to in services and the out to in services were the most common, which is interesting because it does point to a gap in service provision in mainstream, that these actually exist in the first place. And this is the kind of debate, I suppose, that we're all interested in. So the next part of our puzzle then was, when we had that done, when we were able to kind of talk about the positionality piece and so on, we were able to then to challenge the definition that Anne-Marie talked about in the Out of School Review, that report that was done by government in 2022. And basically what we said was that alternative education, according to their definition, is too narrow. It should be broader. It should recognise that inside-outside version, as we talked about there, and to recognise the innovative approaches to teaching and learning, and that for all of those projects, that well-being of the students was at the centre. So that, you know, education was important, but it wasn't the be-all and the end-all. It was the well-being first, and then the educational progression, as well as what Tanya mentioned around the structural inequality, because these projects work to support the person, the family, and the community to try and respond to inequality. So that's our second theme, is where we positioned it and then challenged the overall kind of conceptualization of what this means from an Irish perspective. So our third one then is something that is new as well from an Irish perspective, and hopefully you'll find it interesting as well, is where we go back to the social return on investment approach. Now, I don't know how much you know about social return on investment, but for our youth-friendly version report that we did, that Joe led on, we put in this example here, the one in grey, to describe what social return on investment is. And it's kind of a silly example, but it gives you the idea of it, is that if you had a coffee truck and you went to your local football ground, you know, you'd spend money in your truck and in your coffee and so on, but your return would be the coffee that people buy. So that's a simple way of thinking of return on investment. Whereas if you were to invest in a playground in your area, people donate money to build it, but instead of making money back, the return they get is in the smiles and happiness of the children playing there, in the friendships and so on and so forth that are made. So that's what social return on investment means in a nutshell. So what we're interested in with the social return on investment was, of the money that was invested by Rethink Ireland and by projects, what was the social return? What difference did it make at that softer level for the participants and so on? So we were able to generate this data. And I suppose the thing that we saw as a team that was really interesting, that as we did this with projects and as we developed this set of data, we fed it back to projects individually. And what that allowed them to do was, if they had a logic model or a theory of change guiding their service delivery, they could interrogate that further to say, well, how are we going to respond to these outcomes that are regarded as most valued or not by the participants? So that's kind of where we were starting from. So what does it actually look like? Well, when we did it, this is what we found was that if you look at the three in the table up here, you have the three funds and so on, you have the investment and you have the social return. But when you bring the three funds together, the overall total social value generated across all three funds was 145 million, with a total cost of 18 million. So when you work that out as a ratio, it's 1:8. So for every euro of investment, there was €8 of social value created. Now, in any kind of investment portfolio, be it in social or monetary, that's a fairly strong return on investment. And the benefit of having it expressed in this way, caveats and all included, about how that was arrived at, is that it translates the benefit of and the outcomes, the social outcomes, into a language that policymakers understand, so that if you invest this, you're likely to get this type of outcomes. That's, again, the first time this has been done from an Irish perspective. But that's not all, because we're not about the figure. We're not about the 145 or the 1:8. It's more about what underpins that and what does it actually mean for practice and for the people involved. So this is the bit, I think, that really brings it home, is, as I said, well-being, when we looked at the range of outcomes that were identified from the participants, what we found was that the single common thread or gold thread that was running through all of those was the concept of well-being. So it took us a long time, and we were thinking about this for a good while. How are we going to map this, or how are we going to understand this idea of well-being in relation to alternative education? So what we came across, which was just out as we were doing it, was a taxonomy of well-being, or as we call it, the Understanding Life in Ireland, the Wellbeing Framework. So there are various versions of this, obviously in the UK and kind of in Europe and so on, but we went with our own one. And in that, it talks about that, if you think about GDP and use GDP as the gauge of where things are at and so on, what you do is you miss out on the richness of people's lived experiences. So when you talk about well-being, if you're only using GDP, you miss out on something much more micro. So that got us thinking about it. And what we did was, in the table that you can see here, the outcomes that I just showed you are in the middle column there. And what we were able to do is, in that framework, there are 4 dimensions of well-being. There's dimension 1, mental and physical health; dimension 2, subjective well-being; 3, knowledge, skills and innovation; and then 4 is connection and community participation. So what we were able to do is, we were able to quite easily put those, or locate each one of our outcome areas under the relevant dimension areas. And again, that's something that can be challenged, it can be critiqued, but that's our best effort at trying to understand where they kind of fit and so on. So what did that actually mean when we did it? And this is kind of really interesting from a feeding national policy around well-being. So what we found was that if you take dimension 2, that subjective well-being and so on, is that 44% of the overall total of that 145 million actually fitted into that dimension area. So I'll just go back up for a second. See dimension 2 there. What we're saying is that 44% of all the social value that was created with those outcomes. So in other words, that's the outcome area, dimension 2, that we know that alternative education projects create the most value in, that fits in relation to this well-being framework. So the argument would be is that if we want to create a country at a most macro level that supports well-being of individuals, well then surely we have the evidence for it from evidence from the SROI study. And obviously dimension 4, you can see as well, dimension 4 had a considerable amount of value as well. So the other thing, I'm nearly there, just the other thing to say to you as well as before I finish is the SDGs, but the model that we've come up with to try and understand this. The other element out of all of this is that, when you think big and you think global, we can argue, or we do argue, that the social value created then by the 3 Rethink funds speaks directly to the SDGs. So in the diagram across, you can see there's the primary affiliation and the secondary affiliation. So obviously SDG 3 and 4 are key, but the secondary affiliations also kind of feed into that. So, you can see there quite obviously what relates to what. So as well as being able to generate evidence on the processes and practices and the photo voice within each intervention in each project, when we collate that together through the SROI well-defined outcomes, what we're able to do is talk about the well-being and how these types of interventions can support well-being for these participants. So that's no mean feat, I think, in a way that it brings and joins the dots together in a way that hadn't been done before. So I think I have 3 slides left. What do we know now? So starting off where we were with the evaluation, well, we were asked to identify projects that could serve as models of excellence in overcoming inequality in in and on improving, maintaining good mental health outcomes for young people. So what we have now as a result of our work over the last kind of 5 years is we have the practices and processes, we have the conceptualization and positionality piece done. Number 2, we have established the value of those social outcomes that were achieved by participants using the social return and investment approach. And obviously, just to say for those of you that mightn't know, it's an international framework, it's an accredited framework, which meant that we're all accredited practitioners. So we followed principles, it's a principles-led approach. And our colleague Tim, who helped us from Social Value UK, always reminded us of that it was the voice of the participant was crucial and central to the nature of how that those figures were arrived at. So then to wrap it up, what we're suggesting is that we now have evidence, that bold piece at the bottom, we have evidence now for embedding sustainable wellbeing considerations into the policy and practice of alternative education and youth mental health provision. And we were laughing about this the other day, Joe and myself, but it's a bit clunky in terms of the overall kind of model, but you get an idea of kind of what it's about. So if you think it starting at the top, you have the two funds, the education fund, the mental health fund, the evidence from the years of research that we've done, and the recognition that all of the projects were all about and all focused on the holistic well-being of the person. Now, I'll come on to the Learning Compass in a second. What we've done is we've used policy, the Understanding Life in Ireland, the framework, Department of Education Wellbeing Policy, and the OECD's Learning Compass as a way to understand how and why this might be the case. So just let me finish by bringing you through this piece. So here's the Learning Compass, the OECD Learning Compass and so on. And it's a prism that we suggest is a very useful way to and through which to view our evidence and so on. And what it suggests, as you can see, is that the notion of societal well-being has changed, but that well-being for society is a shared destination, regardless of all the different divisions and ways of understanding that well-being is our ultimate goal and so on. And that's reflected in the diagram there. But more importantly, what the compass does is it talks about, and we really liked this when we came across it, is down in the bottom left, it talks about student agency. So the idea would be that through supports that are relevant, through the care for our students and our young people and so on, they can develop the agency that's necessary for them to continue their journey through that place to get to well-being. But that will only happen through what they term co-agency. And co-agency is with their peers, their teacher, their parents, and so on, which happens obviously in the formal settings, in the non-formal settings, and in the informal settings. So what we're suggesting then is that what the Learning Compass does is it allows us to acknowledge the fact that students need core foundations and core knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. So if you use the lens of the compass to try and understand our work, we can quite easily see the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that have been generated through the work and the outcomes that we just talked about and so on. So we can value then the importance of supporting the development of individual agency and co-agency, which is very much part and parcel of what the projects did with participants. So what we would argue is that the awardee projects have now the evidence to show that they are a crucial part of that well-being journey for the learners or for the participants through what we know from the outcomes and the practices, processes, and the photo voice data. So that's our kind of model, that's our conceptual way of trying to understand this, is that it's ultimately about, I'll just go back up here for a second, I'm nearly done then, it's that bold piece at the bottom is that what we believe we have is evidence for how to embed sustainable well-being considerations into the policy and practice of alternative education in particular, that we didn't have before, because this hadn't been conceptualized or thought through in any particular way before. So just to finish, I'm sure, Sarah, you're delighted to hear me say that, is the last piece we have is this. Again, not to go into the detail of it, but obviously we've recommendations, specific recommendations, and just to say that this will actually be launched by a Minister for our Community and Rural Development is going to launch the whole work next week. Joe can speak more to that obviously, but next Wednesday we're launching all of this work, so it's actually coming at a good time for us to be presenting with you here today. And obviously we have recommendations based on what we talked about there. But the way we kind of see it is that we have a kind of medium to long term actions across the policy, practice, and research communities, or with a research, policy, and practice focus. So, like, sharing this with government is going to be crucial. They know about some of this already because we've been talking to them and so on. They have already started to respond to the out of school education provision report that Anne-Marie talked about, and trying to implement a plan based on that, and obviously trying to inform and create the pathways to show how these innovative approaches can support well-being. From the practice perspective, it's crucial that this is shared so that people within the mainstream system, within the alternative sector, have a space to share this, because otherwise, how is this going to happen? The idea of the continued use of SROI as an approach, and even the critique of that as we go to see how does that work and so on. And then within our own remit, obviously sharing this research with the universities and initial teacher education providers about what does alternative ed look like, why is it important, and so on and so forth. And then obviously from our own perspective, the usual academic progress around papers and journals and conferences and presentations like this, and so on. So that's us done. So I just want to thank everybody of the team for all their hard work over the last number of years. It's unbelievable to think that we're at this point where we're ready to launch the information, and to thank obviously Rethink for their support over the years too. So thanks, Sarah. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I mean, a whistle stop. You crammed in such an amazing amount of information in that short time, and I'm brimming with thoughts and questions, but I don't want to hog all the time, so I would like to open up the floor if we do have any questions from our participants today. I'll be thrilled to hear those before I start hogging your time.
There were no questions in the chat so far. So, Sarah, why don't you start with one question of yours while people are warming up, and launch their questions?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. It sounded like you might have had one there. Did you want to start us off? Oh, and Tim's just arriving. Would we want to give Tim a chance to introduce? Tim, would you like to introduce yourself, because we've heard a lot about your work, but we haven't seen you?
Hi everyone, lovely to be with you. Sorry I couldn't be with you for the whole session. My background's in local economic development in the UK, but for the last 20 years or so specialising in what we now call social value, and maybe in the last 5 years or so specifically within that, a new technique called wellbeing valuation, which we've used in the studies you're probably in the middle of sharing.
Yeah, just done, Tim. Just literally finished the presentation. So, and just to say, Tim has been our expert colleague that introduced us and trained us up on the social return on investment approach, and has been helping us throughout the overall process. So it's great to have Tim here as well.
No, it sounds so exciting and so valuable, and yeah, where to start with all of these questions buzzing in my mind. And I remember an early question that I had was literally related. Joe, you were talking about essentially the number of people you'd helped and the amount of money that you'd invested in those people. And in my head, I had this question, well, what's the return on that? And not the social, the financial, because obviously that's what government always wants to know about. And then, of course, the numbers came through in Cormac's presentation. I thought, well, there's one of my questions answered. And I mean, yeah, who doesn't like an 800% return on investment? Just phenomenal. Yeah, just so exciting. So I'm going to start with a big question, and then maybe some of the smaller questions will come through. I can see a couple are just starting to come in. But what excited me listening to this idea of the social return on investment was how can we bring this really rich learning, not just into other forms of alternative provision that might be in Ireland or might be across Britain as well, but how can we also start to inform mainstream education? Because there's such a lot to be learned from what you've shared, I think.
Yeah. So I don't know where do we start?
I know I said it was a big question.
Yeah. So I'll kick off, and colleagues, please join in as well. I mean, at our level, Sarah, what we've been talking about over the last number of years is going back to the first output that myself and Tanya had in all of this was the space for the discussion to happen between all sorts of providers. So people that are in youth work, for example, people that are in mainstream education, primary or secondary, people that are educators of educators, for example, in third level, and obviously the alternative providers themselves. That forum doesn't exist. There's no place for that to happen, no formal kind of place to that to happen. So it's kind of like them and us. So that the work and the good work, a lot of the good work that's going on in second level, follows a particular approach and a particular way of doing things because it's mandated obviously by policy. But then there's a trick lost because of the space doesn't exist in that kind of formal sense for good practice on either side to translate into the other. So one of our kind of suggestions, one of our arguments was that space needs to be made more visible, or more formal isn't the right word, but more, I don't know what the word you'd use for it, is to make it a place where that can actually happen, and it begins to become less them and us, so that's our initial kind of thought, Tanya, wasn't it? Like from where we were at the very start of and when we got to the first output of the Education Fund.
Yeah, and maybe I would just like to add something that it occurred to me actually during the presentation. It's actually good to present everything at the whole project together now, and then all these questions arise that you never thought about. But even to look at these numbers, right? In, out, in, and so on, and out to in and in to in represent 60-something% of projects, right? Which means we have to also talk about the mainstream education as such, because to me, alternative, we took this remedial approach to alternative education, but maybe we have a remedial system, which has to actually be a little bit looked at, and we have to actually start talking about the mainstream education more through this research, what actually mainstream is doing, and why do we even need alternative education, if you put it like this, right? And this is a question also that we got from the policy at a certain point, that they want to focus on the mainstream. But with the investment that we have, it's a big question. So I think this has to come to the fore. And the second thing, it has to be a sort of a communication between bottom down and top down. I think if it's only happening in one space but not in the other space, I'm not sure we will have an ultimate result. But it's a very, very good question. I think we work in silos, like it's a very general comment all across our societies. Western societies work in silo. And if we are not going to open the windows and doors, I don't think if we can achieve much. And I don't want to sound pessimistic, because sometimes the steps are actually very, very easy. But that's my thought coming from all this. Yeah.
Any other colleagues want to add in as well, please do, for our team.
Oh, thank you. That was really interesting. When you were saying about working in silos, I had this almost an image of silos overlapping like a Venn diagram. So you get these little pockets of collaboration and mutual understanding and respect, but they're just pockets, aren't they? And it doesn't matter how beautiful that lotus-shaped flower is in the middle. What about everybody who's on the outside? So yeah, really very, very interesting. I can see we've got a question. Anna, Dr. Cook, would you like to voice your question? Would you like to come on camera and speak, or are you able to do that?
Hi, yes. 1 second, just going to. Hello. Yes, thank you for really interesting presentations. I was just interested to know how the measurement was made of the participant outcomes other than photo voice, and particularly in relation to the SROI in terms of how these, I mean, obviously, I'm probably wouldn't understand all the technicalities of how the calculations were made, but just in terms of how you're able to measure impact through those 16 categories that you mentioned.
So Tim, do you want to say a little bit about the overarching SROI first of all, maybe, and then we can talk about the specifics, just about, you know, how we do that at an overall level for SROI.
Yep, sure. So the general process follows the same process as cost-benefit analysis that funders, governments all love, reasonably familiar with. The difference is a set of principles overriding it, which gives us a different kind of normative starting position. So cost-benefit analysis normally practiced to understand how much of a policy objective can be achieved for a fixed amount of money. By overriding that process with a set of principles, we try and open it up and reveal some missing value. And so it starts with an open question and a qualitative process, which Tanya and others can share some of the fun we had doing that with these kind of organizations at the start, to find out what their definition of change is. So not starting with a list of education policy objectives and how many of those can we hit young people over the head with in a sausage machine, but an open question. So that gave us a longer list than the 16 that we had, but we then had some discussions about trying to put those in a taxonomy and the qualitative challenges of a bottom-up or a top-down approach. So, and we needed to find a combination of both of those. So one of the principles is that the voice of the young person or the learner is preserved here. So that forces it bottom up, that if a young person says something has changed, then that is an outcome and no one can deny that. But when you want to aggregate that, not just in one fund, but multiple funds, we then need some kind of mechanism of organizing those things to be able to aggregate them and answer some of those questions. So there's that qualitative piece. Then for each of those, the value is derived by a quantitative piece that again goes back to those young people and learners, and says, look, for these things that you've told us have changed in your life that you described earlier, how big a change was it? How long does it last? How important is it to you? And could it have happened another way? So is it definitely down to this intervention, 100%, do you think? Or could it be down to something or someone else in your life before we go and claim that something that we see in front of us must be 100% down to us because there's a correlation? Each of those have a bit of coding and a number put on them and goes into a spreadsheet with a very big calculation, and we arrive at some numbers. The final bit of the jigsaw, and I'd be interested in your views on this, is then partly an ethical and moral question. Should we put a euro value on that number that pops out at the end or not? Mm-hmm. Social return on investment says you should. And we spend, those of us that do it, all our time sitting on this knife edge or double-edged sword, where on the one hand, if you don't, people don't listen. Money talks. All of our other decisions, resource allocations, policy are made based on, show me the money. But I think there is a strong moral, ethical case to say you should never put a euro value on a young person's independence or an older person's dignity. So we sit on that knife edge. We try whenever we can to talk about what this does tell us and what it doesn't tell us. But Cormac can also tell some stories about, as soon as we had one number, what the media in Ireland did with that number as soon as it went out there. So there are There are challenges there, but the underlying principle and why we go there is to try and highlight things that otherwise are hidden value that starts with the lived experience of those young people, but that if that remains just a qualitative story for some audiences, it doesn't equate unless you put a number on it. Now there's I hope you can all see I'm shooting myself in the foot with some circular reasoning there, that as soon as you put a number on it, you shoot yourself in the foot and we're playing their game. And so we sit on that double-edged sword.
Yeah, and just to say to that, thanks, Tim, and just to say, Anna, in relation to that as well, if I may, is that when we launched our first report back in 2021, I remember driving home that evening, and there was a report on Prime Radio slot and so on, and all they talked about was that figure. So the 1 is to whatever it was, 1 is to 8 or 1 is to 9, I can't remember what it was, the figure. So that's exactly what Tim is talking about. And I suppose the other side of it is Tanya de St. Croix in King's College has written a lot about this critique of what she calls the monetization of young people and the monetization of services. Is that sense of like, should you, if you have a high return rate, should you invest in only those that have, above a certain threshold? So if it's 1 is to 5, well, then everything above that gets funded and anything below that doesn't get funded. So like what we found, and we had a good discussion with Rethink, obviously, with Tim about this, is some of our projects, those figures I gave you there are macro figures from across all of the projects, because we didn't, for league table reasons, we didn't release the individual figures to publicly. But the point is that we had some projects that had a return rate of 1 is to 1 or 1 is to 1.5, and they were fantastic projects. But because of factors associated with staff student ratio or the costs of providing the service, that meant that the return was a lot less. So there's a huge ethical issue about this for us and for our team. And with Tim, what we're always trying to talk about is that the figure sharpens your senses, but what we really want is we want to be able to talk about the practices and processes of how that figure was arrived at, because that's ultimately what matters. Is the response of a provider to a young person is about building relationships, it's about building that self-confidence, it's about building those outcomes that ultimately then will go on and can be valued, from a broader perspective. But that's the challenge, and it's something that we're acutely aware of, and it's a really good question to ask, because that's the nub of it, really.
Thank you very much. So interesting. Sarah, would you allow me to just follow it up with one additional question?
I think that will be absolutely fine. And I'm conscious, I noticed I missed Shelley out, so we'll call on Shelley after this.
Sorry, just it was also interesting how the 16 outcomes were mapped to the 4 areas of the wellbeing framework. And I just had the question in my mind as to the extent to which those outcomes were equally weighted within those 4 areas, or did you find, I think you mentioned that subjective well-being had a higher weighting, or did I misunderstand that?
No, so what we did, the first part of that puzzle was we looked at various taxonomies of well-being to try and understand what was there, how it was conceptualized, in the different models and so on. And, they all, as you well know from the psychology background, they all kind of fed, the same or similar types of descriptors, so that that it might be slightly different in different models and so on. So we went with the Irish one, as I said, because it was something that obviously we're trying to work towards and so on. So at what Tim had worked with us on was to identify the most valued outcomes across the overall project or set of projects. So what we did then is we mapped those onto the framework. So in terms of value, we didn't say, for example, on that mapping piece, we didn't say, we didn't show the individual value of each outcome, but that's in the previous step. So you can kind of find that in the previous step. All we did was add the overall value created by those outcomes as they fitted into each of the dimension areas. So that's what I was talking about, the 44%. That's what that 44% is. It's a summation of the value that was created by the outcomes that are mapped into that dimension.
Thanks very much.
feel as though it's me talking all the time. Shelley, are you still there? Would you like to come on screen and ask your question? I noticed earlier that Shelley dropped in and out, so she may have lost her connection. But I think it's a really interesting question. Have you any plans to connect or collaborate with other countries and nations? Obviously, you've done some research comparatively, and so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, not speaking for the team, but please add in as you see fit. I mean, the early work we did, as Tanya mentioned, was to look at it from a literature perspective to see what was there from an alternative education perspective. Now that we have what we have and what we know, obviously there's kind of a bit of rework to be done, if you want to call it that, to see how we can conceptualize it and figure it out. So we've some work done on that already in terms of publications and so on and papers. But I mean, that will involve, I mean, obviously the Torreali work in Australia, obviously in the UK itself, there are lots of like the Mills and Thompson and so on. There's lots of good work that we can now address more appropriately because we have our evidence that we know kind of where that fits and so on. So that's kind of our next phase is to do that. And I just mentioned it, you might have seen it on the last slide there. One of the things that became very apparent as we did it was that has been done elsewhere is that the longitudinal tracking of the learners in these alternative settings would be really valuable to continue to see how does the work that was done with them, you know, have a positive impact on their life as they go forward. So that's something that we've been talking about, as well as has been done elsewhere, that we'd love to do as well, you know, as part of the work. So Tanya, I don't know, do you want to add anything else to that kind of piece of the international?
I mean, absolutely. Like, it would be fantastic to continue with the work and to do something more internationally also, you know, because again, how does this fit in a general idea of education and so on? But yeah, I mean, it depends on the opportunity, the opportunities that are kind of coming also financially towards us, if we put it like this in a very diplomatic language.
Yeah.
Sarah, I think there's another person.
Yes, I can see Sinead and then Lisa. So Sinead, would you like to ask a question? Thank you.
Thank you. Sinead O'Neill from UCC in Cork. Just firstly to congratulate you on the research. It's fantastic and so needed. So well done, and looking forward to see more of it when it's launched. So I have two questions. One is just around, you mentioned the slightly different approach taken in Scotland with the inclusion units within schools. And I suppose I just wanted to get your view on whether you see merit in that, or whether, you know, you think that might undermine the autonomy of alternative education settings. So I'd be interested to hear your view on that. And the second question then, Cormac, you just mentioned that you've been talking to the Department of Education, and was just interested to hear what the response was. Just, you know, I suppose when you look at the out of school provision review, it does look a little bit like a fait accompli, in that there was an agenda there to conceptualize alternative education in a certain way and to proceed with policy development, you know, in response to that or from that. So I'd be very interested to hear how those discussions have been and how open they've been to the research as well. So thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, Sinead. If we go with the bottom one first, or the second one first, and we can work back to the other one. So the response from the department, that's kind of been interesting, because they have sat on we had an advisory board from the very start. So we had a senior member of the Department of Education sitting on our advisory board. And one thing that always stuck in our mind was, and Tanya referred to it in the presentation, about the 92% completion. So those that start in first year and who completes in senior cycle in second level or second level. When we were discussing that, you know, the view that 92% was good enough is exactly what we were told, and that the 8% was a lot higher 10 years ago, was a lot higher 20 years ago. So I think there's an ideological thing, Sinead, going back to the point of, you know, as Tanya talked about a meritocratic system in Ireland and so on, that it's accepted as as a kind of a fait accompli, is that's the way it's going to be, and that this is what that we're really happy with our system. We have 92% people completing and so on. We're doing well in PISA. So I think the first part of my answer to your second question, if that makes sense, is there's a debate that we need to have as a country around the ideological notion of what education is about, what's it for, and the other thing to say that another colleague said to us that has really stuck with us as well is that you might say that the education system is broken because you have children that fall out of the system or fade out of the system, as they've told us themselves. But what a colleague said to us was the education system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that's kind of fairly, that would make the hairs stand in the back of your head when you think about it, because if that's what we want, and as Tanya mentioned from the research, since the 60s, have we actually done anything to question or to challenge structural inequality? And we're all part of that. Obviously, we're all part of that question and so on. So there's an issue there. But the first thing about the ideological piece, you're right. Our perception as well, Sinead, from the Out of School Review, is that it was very much deficit based. It was about fixing the child. And maybe I'm being too crude or too harsh, but it was definitely, we didn't get a sense from it that it was about the well-being or about the strengths of the child or the person involved. It was very much about fix. And the fait accompli bit, Sinead, is, and we'll soon know about it, but our hunch would be that it is mainstream at all costs. It's, in other words, to fund mainstream, fund school completion programs, fund all of the DESH that Tanya talked about, all of those kind of core areas that Anne-Marie mentioned as well from the alternative. Those pieces are keep the child in mainstream regardless, and only at the worst case scenario should they go anywhere else. And like we know from the international literature, we know from what we've been told with the qualitative data, we know that doesn't work for every child. So ideologically and procedurally, we think we could have a fight in our hands as a community, to think about these things, because we're at that crossroads. As I said at the very start, that Mills and Thompson's review of alternative education in the UK, shows that the UK, or that England in particular, is well ahead of Ireland because of the way that it's kind of set up and so on. We're at that crossroads where we can really define it as a community to say what we want and what we think is important. So that's the answer to your I think to the second part of your question. Colleagues might have other things to say as well, Marie-Jo, but Tanya, from the point of view of the Scotland inclusion units and so on, do you want to say a little bit about that? Is that all right, Sinead, in terms of the first bit, or the?
Thank you so much. Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Cormac.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to discuss Scotland as such, but let's say, I'm originally from Slovenia, and we don't have alternative education in Slovenia, for example. So just mainstream system works a bit differently. In mainstream system at home, we very much have much more support on a school level for children in place. So each school, regardless where it is, has its own psychologist, pedagogical worker, even its own kitchen. So, these little things that even when you think about the structure of the school and how the school is run already as a structure is very, very different than in Ireland. And I see also in practice how it runs in Ireland, because I have children in school as well. I think it has to, I completely agree with Cormac, it has to be a much bigger conversation. How do we imagine education actually? First of all, this idea of imagining it has to come to the core, and not firefighting as much as we do. So going more towards more sustainable way of thinking how to build education. And then we can also start thinking, what actually is alternative education? Is it a choice-based approach? Is it remedial approach, and so on? But I think at the moment is a little bit of a chaos, if you ask me. But that's a little bit of an external view as well. I'm going to sign that, and I'm very open today. So, but thank you very much for the question, Sinead. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for the interesting responses.
Jo, did you want to contribute to this question?
I was just going to say, just Sinead, in response to your question about the out of school review implementation group, I don't dispute what Cormac has said, but maybe a slight bit of optimism in that I think there's a report pending from that group, and when the group one of our colleagues is on that group. When that group was first talking about, modalities, they were talking about one modality. So essentially, a child doesn't fit in the mainstream system. They need somewhere to go for a specified period of time. And over the course of that review process, it seems that there's been a shift towards different modalities for young people. So a short-term option, but also a medium and a long-term option, and maybe more openness to different kind of forms of education depending on the unique needs of the learners. So I think there's a sliver of hope there. Having said that, I think a lot of the things that Cormac raised and the research team would raise are very valid, and we definitely had questions about the operationalization of that report, and the report has yet to be published, but I was slightly encouraged by that.
Thank you, Jo. Lisa, you had a question, and I think we're probably coming towards the end of our time, but Lisa, please.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to ask about how it addresses structural inequality. And are you talking about inequality in terms of the well-being that you discussed, or more broader socioeconomic equality or inclusion or outcomes? Because as you said, the kind of school system as it is doing what it's supposed to do, which is kind of more of a sorting meritocratic mechanism. And the government maybe at best look at social mobility, but that almost presupposes the inequality. So what kind of structural inequality is it you're looking at it improving, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so again, I can kick off and colleagues can join in. I think, thanks, Lisa. It was a really interesting question and a very difficult one, because it's such a nebulous kind of concept to try and to put your finger on. I think for us, what we've seen over the kind of the duration of the project is that the system, the mainstream system, doesn't see the individual. So when the individual comes from or comes with a whole notion and a whole set of factors that impinge on their ability to progress in education, sometimes because of where they are and who they are, the system doesn't see that fully. So not to say that some good work isn't being done and so on to try and address that, but as a whole, it doesn't see. And Tanya mentioned it in the figures around, the notion of inequality and so on. So our understanding of it from what we have seen is that what the projects do is, the first thing that they do is that they see the person. They see the person and they see and try to understand the intersectional nature of where they're coming from. So, what are the things that they bring with them? But on top of that, or if you like, even supporting that, is they pick out and help them to pick out the strengths, first of all, that the person has, so that they work with them to develop those soft outcomes that I talked about earlier, which we have found then contributes to their overall progression in the education system, be it through a certificate program, or be it through a diploma program, or be it through the formal or slower version of the formal system, and so on. So at a structural level, I suppose our understanding of it, and you can tell us what we think or what you think, is that, if at an individual level, people that wouldn't have had a voice, would have been forgotten about, would have been kind of put outside of the structure, are supported to progress and develop towards that education and overall kind of well-being piece, that in itself begins to question the structure, and that in itself, through their voice and through the voice of the projects, begins to over time question the status quo of how things are done. So that's our kind of, I suppose, starting point around the conceptualization of structure and as Tanya mentioned, the agency and structure kind of relationship. So it's not that it's going to change overnight, but it's going to, the more and more people that would have not gone through, would have not been supported, that are supported, will ultimately have a voice, and they will ultimately be able to say, well, hold on a second, this was my experience and this is what needs to change. So that's what we were trying to document. And as Tim mentioned, that's what the SROI does, is it privileges the voice of the participant to identify what those outcomes are that are important for them, that wouldn't necessarily have been achieved otherwise. So I've gone around the houses, but hopefully that's our, I suppose, starting point around structural change, is the individual. So I'm sure colleagues will have something to add to that as well.
Can I just add one thing? Lisa, thank you so much for your question. Actually, it's a very important question, I think. Just for me being with the project for a little while, right? And all these questions are still flying in my head. So it's a very complicated question, I think. So definitely we start first with economic inequality, right? Which is very visible if you put it like this. And even this, idea that we have how the school system is structured, right? Like we have dash and non-dash schools. This is already something telling us about inequality as such on a macro level, if you put it like this. And then beside this, we have all these programs that are supporting mainly dash schools, if you put it like this. So there is something about this economic inequality as a start. But I think there is another complexity there, which just came to my mind when we actually worked with those programs, particularly those that are out, and out would be very much those ones that are alternative centers not associated to the mainstream school at all, right? Those who have no connections. So this is margin to the margin, if you put it like this, right? When you actually spoke to people there about the needs of their students, the needs of students were not always necessarily connected only with economic inequality as such, but a set of very new set of needs emerged in connection to being neurodivergent or autism and so on. And I think this is a new level of thinking about inequality as well. What do we actually do with a group of students who now all of a sudden do not fit in the mainstream school as such, might not be economically disadvantaged, but bring different levels of disadvantage. And I don't, now I use the term disadvantage, which I shouldn't. I think we should talk about inequality, but we might actually have to even conceptualize what inequality in educational setting is in the current place and time. So I really appreciate this question. You made me think a lot, and I didn't answer properly just yet, but thank you so much.
That brings us back to the intersectionality of it all, doesn't it? It's a really good question, and exactly the same things that we're talking about in England and across other parts of the UK. So yeah, I mean, I'm still brimming with questions, but I'm very conscious of time. SIG colleagues, would you like to add anything?
No, I'm really pleased that some of the questions have already been asked, and the team has been really generous in answering in real great depth and detail. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing more from it, and hopefully, like some others suggested, maybe some collaborations. In England, I can't think of a study that's been done like this here. And will be very, very much needed. So thank you so much, and thank you, of course, Joe, as well. For funding these projects. They make a massive difference. Thank you. Thank you to you all.
So yes, just want to thank you all for coming along. Thank you all for sharing this. Really, I mean, it's very insightful. The projects themselves are impressive, but the deeper learning that we can gain from all of this through our own discussions and our own further teachings, they're really important. We look forward. I noticed it looked like some of the slides had some project pages in. Maybe there's a report that we could share with our. Yeah, so perhaps if we could have the report link and we can share that in our next newsletter, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. And yeah, just big thank you from all of us. And we really look forward to hearing more of this in future events.